Nehemiah chapter 7. Now that the wall had been rebuilt, I had the doors set up, and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites were put in charge of them. Over Jerusalem I placed Hanani, my brother, and Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, who was more trustworthy and God-fearing than most. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot, and while the sun is still shining they shall shut and bar the doors. Appoint as sentinels the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their watchposts, and others in front of their own houses. Census of the province. Now, the city was quite wide and spacious, but its population was small, and none of the houses had been rebuilt. When my God had inspired me to gather together the nobles, the magistrates, and the people, and to examine their family records, I came upon the family list of those who had returned in the earliest period. There I found the following written. These are the inhabitants of the province who returned from the captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away, and who came back to Jerusalem and Judah, to their own cities. They returned with Zerubbabel, Shua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Ramiah, Nahamani, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispereth, Bigvai, Nehum, and Bana. The census of the people of Israel. Descendants of Parosh, 2,172. Descendants of Shephisha, 372. Descendants of Era, 652. Descendants of Pahat Moab who were descendants of Shua and Job, 2,818. Descendants of Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Zaddo, 845. Descendants of Zakkai, 760. Descendants of Benwi, 648. Descendants of Babai, 628. Descendants of Asjad, 2,322. Descendants of Adonikam, 667. Descendants of Bigvai, 2,067. Descendants of Adin, 655. Descendants of Ader who were descendants of Hezekiah, 98. Descendants of Hashem, 328. Descendants of Bezai, 324. Descendants of Haroth, 112. Descendants of Gibeon, 95. People of Bethlehem and Netopha, 188. People of Anathoth, 128. People of Bethazmaaveth, 42. People of Kiriath Jearim, Chephirah, and Beeroth, 743. People of Ramah and Geba, 621. People of Michmas, 122. People of Bethel and Ai, 123. People of Nebo, 52. Descendants of the other Elam, 1,254. Descendants of Haram, 320. Descendants of Jericho, 345. Descendants of Lod, Hadid, and Ono, 721. Descendants of Senat, 3,930. The priests, descendants of Jedaiah of the house of Shua, 973. Descendants of Immer, 1,052. Descendants of Pashhur, 1,247. Descendants of Haram, 1,017. The Levites, descendants of Shua, Kadmiel of the descendants of Hodaviah, 74. The singers, descendants of Asaph, 148. The gatekeepers, descendants of Shallum, descendants of Ader, descendants of Talmon, descendants of Akub, descendants of Hadadah, descendants of Shobai, 138. The temple servants, descendants of Zihah, descendants of Hashupha, descendants of Tabaoth. Descendants of Kuros, descendants of Sia, descendants of Padon. Descendants of Lebanah, descendants of Hagabah, descendants of Shalma. Descendants of Hanan, descendants of Gidel, descendants of Gahar. Descendants of Reaiah, descendants of Rezin, descendants of Nekoda. Descendants of Gazam, descendants of Ua, descendants of Pasi. Descendants of Basai, descendants of the Munites, descendants of the Nephuzites, descendants of Bakbuk, descendants of Hakupha, descendants of Harhur, descendants of Bajlith, descendants of Mehida, descendants of Harsha, descendants of Barkos, descendants of Sisera, descendants of Timah, descendants of Neziah, descendants of Hatipha, descendants of Solomon's servants, descendants of Sotai, descendants of Sephareth, descendants of Perida, descendants of Jalah, descendants of Darkon, descendants of Gedel, descendants of Shephisha, descendants of Hadal, descendants of Pochereth-Hazebaim, descendants of Ammon. The total of the temple servants and the descendants of Solomon's servants was 392. The following who returned from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer were unable to prove that their ancestral houses and their descent were Israelite. Descendants of Deliah, descendants of Tobiah, descendants of Nekoda, 642. Also, of the priests, descendants of Hobiah, descendants of Hakaz, descendants of Barzillai, he had married one of the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadite and was named after him. These men searched their family records, but their names could not be found written there, hence they were disqualified from the priesthood. And the governor ordered them not to partake of the most holy foods until there should be a priest to consult the Urim and Thummim. The entire assembly taken together came to 42,360. Not counting their male and female servants, who were 7,337. They also had 200 male and female singers. Their horses were 736, their mules 245. Their camels 435, their donkeys 6,720. Certain of the heads of ancestral houses contributed to the temple service. The governor put into the treasury 1,000 drachmas of gold, 50 basins, 30 vestments for priests, and 500 minas of silver. Some of the heads of ancestral houses contributed to the treasury for the temple service, 20,000 drachmas of gold and 2,200 minas of silver. The contributions of the rest of the people amounted to 20,000 drachmas of gold, 2,000 minas of silver, and 67 vestments for priests. The priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all Israel took up residence in their cities.